As a developer, you love building things that are fun and that matter. Do you want to add authentication to yet another app? Do you want to stay updated with all the security issues and patch them? Why not leave that to the experts? Auth0 is the easiest and fastest way to implement real-world authentication and authorization architectures into your apps and APIs. You can allow your users to log in with either regular username and password, social identity providers like Facebook and Twitter, or enterprise identity providers like Active Directory, Office 365, or without passwords with an email login like Slack or phone login like WhatsApp. Getting started is very easy. Add authentication to your Angular 1 or 2 Plus or Ionic app in less than 10 minutes by writing only a few lines of code. No credit card required. Get the free plan or try the enterprise plan for 21 days at auth0.io/adventures in Angular. That's auth0 with the number 0. Auth0 is trusted by developers at Atlassian, Mozilla, Bluetooth, Optimizely, Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Try it out at auth0.io/adventures in Angular. That's the number 0 in Auth0, and get back time building core features. Hey, everybody, and welcome. If it sounds a little bit different, it's because we're doing this live. We're at Microsoft Connect, and I'm here with Amanda Silver.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going well. Now, you were in the keynote. You did your little spiel with the Visual Studio Live Share, which was really cool.
Yep.
And I have been told that you are the TypeScript/future of JavaScript guru.
Well, I've been working on TypeScript and JavaScript for a long time. My team actually spans the Visual Studio core platform, VS Code itself, the TypeScript and JavaScript language service that kind of power the experience in both Visual Studio and VS Code, as well as like the Chakra JavaScript engine that's part of Microsoft.
Nice.
So we work on a lot of different JavaScript-y things.
Awesome. And we've talked about a lot of these things over the years with Microsoft folks. But I think one of the things that's really interesting that maybe we should just start with is TypeScript.
Yeah.
Now, I run an Angular podcast and a JavaScript podcast. And so, TypeScript's kind of been adopted by the Angular core team.
Yeah.
And so I've played with it and I like it. What's always interesting to me is, what's new in TypeScript? Because it seems like your team tries to sort of mirror, reflect what's coming in JavaScript, right? The new features, the new standards that they come out with.
Yep. Yeah. So I mean, I would say that we have a multi-pronged strategy for like how we think about what new language features should come to TypeScript. Obviously, we need to follow the standard very closely. And we decided very early in TypeScript's, inception that TypeScript would always be a superset of the JavaScript standard, ECMAScript. And so what that meant, especially since the ECMAScript standard continues to evolve, is that we've had to stay very, very involved in the future of the ECMAScript standard. And actually, one of the editors, or the editor at the moment of the ECMAScript standard, Brian Turleson, is also on my team. And so he goes to the TC39 meetings every, 2 months. And one of his jobs is to make sure that, the JavaScript standard doesn't go in a completely different direction than the TypeScript programming language, and that the two kind of, as much as we can, kind of keep them aligned. But, because we made that commitment that TypeScript will always be a superset of the ECMAScript standard, we need to make sure that there's not something that's introduced in either language that wouldn't eventually be adopted by the other. So that's one input. But in addition to that, our original mission with TypeScript was actually to make it possible for JavaScript coders to kind of write larger scale applications. And at the time that TypeScript kind of came into being, which was like 2010 or something like that, that was about the time that Microsoft was kind of completing our first major web-based product, which was SharePoint. And we were just at the beginning of starting to do the Office 365 kind of transitions, where we took, very large code bases of Word and Excel and brought them into browser contexts, right? And so with that, we basically had a situation where the Office team was kind of coming to us as the programming languages and tools team at Microsoft and said, like, we don't know how to deal with JavaScript that's this large. What do you recommend? And they had some various different solutions, some of which are actually still in use today.
Backbone, right?
No. I mean, they have internal tools that have never been released publicly.
Oh, interesting.
That do things like that TypeScript do, like type checking and things like that, but also minification and other things like that. Tier splitting in some cases. Just a whole bunch of different, like what executes on the server side and what executes on the client side. And so we met with them and we kind of tried to figure out like what would be a roadmap that would allow us to have a tool set that the Office team could take a dependency on, but also make sure that we weren't building just tools for Office, that they were something that the broader JavaScript community would use as well.
Right.
And so that's kind of where TypeScript came from originally. But then when we launched it, which was 2012, so it actually took quite a while for us to kind of, iterate on it and get it to the point where it was ready to be publicly consumed. We really didn't know whether or not it would be embraced by the JavaScript community. At that time, Microsoft didn't exactly have the best reputation in the JavaScript community,
true.
right? And so I think we were very careful about how we brought it out. And we really wanted to make sure that if it was going to be adopted, that it was, community support and community strength that kind of, drove it, as opposed to some kind of, Microsoft marketing push.
Right. That makes sense. And it feels like you've really done that, right? I mean, a lot of the tools, the way that the TypeScript virtual machine integrates with things like Visual Studio Code, but other systems as well. And then just all of the feedback that you get as you work through TypeScript, or even just JavaScript with the TypeScript engine running, has really enhanced the way a lot of people build their apps. Yeah,
I mean, so it's been a really interesting, 5 years or so, because what's happened is we've been learning how to build better tools for JavaScript developers over time.
Right.
And when we started TypeScript, we had actually just moved our JavaScript language service in Visual Studio from a I don't even know how to describe it. It was a semi-compiled based language system. And then at that time, we had actually moved to a partial execution based language system, where we actually executed part of your program to build up a runtime model of what your program was describing, and then we would power the language services like IntelliSense and Squiggles and things like that based on that. And we did that for a couple of years. And then as we started to develop TypeScript and build out the language service for TypeScript, we started to realize that the TypeScript language service could actually be a more effective language service for JavaScript than our current execution-based one. And so for about a year or so, we actually were running them both internally. And what we wanted to do was to kind of see at what point would it be embraced by users, and they would prefer the TypeScript-based language service over the JavaScript execution-based language service. I know this is like geeky compiler stuff, but
it's fascinating, and we go deep on the show. So it's
cool. Well, yeah. So I can go super deep on compilers and languages because I've been working on it for like 16 years. So anyway, so we tested that for a year or so. And over time, we basically turned that on as the default in Visual Studio. And then when VS Code came out, it actually has been the basis for it from the beginning, was the kind of emerging language service. And then only in the last year did we make the TypeScript language service the JavaScript-based language service fully.
Wow.
Yeah. So like I would say that the JavaScript tooling and the TypeScript tooling has really come a long way over the last 5 years. And I think it's a pretty, good experience now. And especially now that we have VS Code, which is a pretty, great editor.
Yeah, it's really nice.
when you couple that with the TypeScript-based language service, plus the integrated debugger for, Node and for Chrome and other things like that. And of course, other runtimes like Edge and Chakra, then it's a pretty good end-to-end JavaScript coding experience.
I agree. I completely agree. So one thing that I'm curious about is we dive into this because, and just to give you an example, when I was learning to code professionally, I kind of came up on Ruby on Rails, right? Yeah. And, I always thought of Mats as kind of the consummate Ruby developer. And then all of my dreams and hopes were dashed because he's a C developer, right? He built Ruby in C. And so I wonder, if you're building this engine for JavaScript or TypeScript, I mean, what are you working in, day out?
So TypeScript itself is written in TypeScript, and that has always been a necessity. Actually, Anders Heilsberg has kind of demanded that from day one. And Steve Luco was also one of the kind of original inventors and implementers of TypeScript. He actually, at the time that he started working on TypeScript, he was also working on the Chakra runtime. And so he also demanded that. Like he wanted to, make sure that the compiler was a workload for the Chakra runtime.
Gotcha.
So that's been kind of how it's been implemented from day one. Chakra, on the other hand, is in essence is a system component of Windows. And so really a lot of the work in Chakra itself is compiling down to machine language that works well on various different, chip architectures. So that a lot of that's written in C and C++.
Right.
But, that said, there are some higher level abstractions in the language that are more appropriate to be written in JavaScript and kind of they then get compiled down to C and C++.
Right. So one of the things, depending on who you talk to, so there's some people that, they love JavaScript. Everything about JavaScript is the way that it ought to be, right? Yeah. And then it seems like there's this diaspora of JavaScript where people are writing in backend languages that aren't JavaScript, and so there are things about JavaScript that they find kind of quirky.
Yeah.
Are some of those things hard to build into a system like TypeScript or JavaScript engine?
Quirky. So there are many aspects of JavaScript that are quirky. In terms of, I like your description of diaspora, because in a lot of ways I would say that there are people who love JavaScript because it's the best functional programming language in the world, they think.
Yeah.
Or it's the best object-oriented programming language in the world. Or, they just like scripting languages and they like that aspect of it. And I would say that each one of those different constituencies have a kind of different lens on what JavaScript really is, right? So I definitely see that. And even just thinking about the JavaScript, the Good Parts book, like that was the beginning of kind of defining what a subset of JavaScript was, right? And then the strict mode came out, and that was another, chapter of what, good JavaScript kind of looked like. And in a way, TypeScript is also another, it's a JavaScript linter in some ways. So I definitely think that there are kind of like different faces of JavaScript.
Right.
And then there are those things that compile down to JavaScript that aren't JavaScript at all, right? So there's many different faces of JavaScript. In terms of the quirkiness of JavaScript and kind of the historical legacy of JavaScript, is that hard to deal with? As someone who has done language design in the past, I definitely recognize that the historical legacy of what you're working with can sometimes make it challenging to introduce new features.
Right.
Let const is the perfect example of that in JavaScript.
I still see people on Twitter going,
right. And I mean, in C#, it's var versus explicit types. Like there are preferences that end up happening, right?
Yeah.
But I think the other thing that's kind of an interesting challenge in quirkiness in JavaScript is creating an optimized JavaScript runtime.
Oh, right.
That can deal with the quirkiness and the
make it fast
flexibility.
For me, please.
Well, it's not just make it fast. It's like JavaScript is one of the most flexible programming languages that there is. And so being able to preserve that flexibility,
absolutely,
but also optimize the code that gets generated so that it runs as fast as native code or as close as we can get, that can be challenging.
Yeah, make it fast and don't take away my toys.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Yeah.
So how do language designers? I mean, if you were going to approach this versus maybe another language, I mean, how do you look at JavaScript? I mean, do you still break it down by, tokenizing and parsing and things like that, or do you consider the use cases? Like, does that really play into the decisions you make as you're deciding? Okay, we're building TypeScript this way versus that way.
Well, I mean, I think I've been working with Anders for 15 years, 16 years now. And one of the things that I've picked up from him, as well as other people in the programming languages community at Microsoft, and I think that this is something that kind of just comes from the core DNA of Microsoft kind of focusing on developers, but also just the fact that we have a big focus on developer tooling, is that languages should be designed with tooling in mind.
That's interesting, because usually when people talk about languages, they talk about the programming experience as far as how I write my code, not the tooling.
Yeah, just the aesthetics of looking at the code and things like that. But I think for us, when we do language design, a lot of what we think about is, can it be optimized? We definitely think about that. But we also think about, can we build a tooling experience that is satisfying for you as you write the code? Can we have something that has good statement completion? Can we, do type checking and things like that? Can we identify errors? Are we creating a ton of foot guns in the language, right?
Foot guns?
You've never heard the term foot guns?
I don't think I've heard the term.
It's the idea that we're going to give you a gun that you can shoot your foot with, right? Like that's not a good thing, right?
No.
And we don't want to create foot guns in the language, right? So that's, I think, probably the biggest thing that we think about is just, okay, as we do the language design itself, how do we think the tooling would look? Not just how would the authoring experience be, like statement completion, stuff like that, but also the debugging experience is also really important.
Right. Yeah, essentially what you're looking for is, how does this enable us to build tools that fit with the thought processes going on?
Exactly. It's all about mental models. Yeah. Like, what's so cool about software in general and kind of programming languages and developers especially is it's all, ideas being built on top of ideas, right? And so like all of it is basically how can I build a tool? Like, from my perspective, I work on programming languages and tools, developer tools. My whole, mentality is like, how can I build a better tool for you to express your idea? Right. And there's somebody else who's building tools underneath me that allow me to express my ideas. So it's what, turtles all the way down? Is that what
that's how the saying goes.
Yeah.
So how do you do that then? Like, what do you put into TypeScript, or your team? What does your team put into TypeScript that makes it so that the tooling can be built up the way that it is to make my development experience what I want it to be?
It's things as simple as when we think about an expression, what order do various clauses come in? When we think about introducing new tokens, like introducing tokens is actually a huge deal, because that really has an effect on the aesthetic of the language itself. And you also, especially in the thinking about new tokens, you have to think about what the ecosystem looks like, right? Like, we have JS doc or some other kind of doc system that lives on top of JavaScript, like or other metadata systems, attributes. Angular has their own set of attributes that they have on top. Like, we have to think about the entire ecosystem, and kind of, if we're going to reserve a token or a keyword or something like that, we have to think about the ecosystem impacts of that as well.
Interesting. Do you have an example of sort of from where you start all the way up through something like Visual Studio Code, where a feature or a language implementation idea comes through?
I'm trying to think about something specific in the TypeScript space. So I think it was with async await that we were kind of trying to take some of the stuff that we had done in C# and kind of bring some of that capability into TypeScript. And one of the things that a lot of people use TypeScript for is as a transpilation service so that you can get the future of JavaScript now, right?
Yep.
And so one of the challenges that we had in the last 2 years or so is like, if we have to compile TypeScript down to ECMAScript 5,
right.
How is that going to work, right? And so the big debate that ensued with that one was to do that in a way that we could compile down to, I think it had a dependency on generators and other things like that. To do that, we actually had to have a multi-phase compilation system in the compiler itself. And so the community was kind of requesting it, but we couldn't figure out how to do it without having this multi-phase compilation impact. And with that, like the impact, of course, is that your performance could slow down because you have to do multiple phases of compilation. So, those are the kinds of trade-offs that we have to do. And in the end, I think we ended up doing it. But it's, it'll go away over time as, we no longer need to compile down to ECMAScript 5 because all of the browsers are updated. But yeah, so that's an example of the type of thing. Yeah.
I guess something you said kind of triggered another question that I have, and that is you mentioned the browsers are updating, and so I guess the minimum common denominator, right? That's constantly moving.
Yeah.
How does that affect the development of things like TypeScript?
Well, I mean, that's a good example where basically like the building blocks on top of which we could work or the runtime capabilities on top of the engines that we can compile down to are evolving, and it gives us more flexibility and ability to do new things.
Right.
Another interesting example is like with the internationalization APIs, right? When we wanted to introduce, and I think we were the sponsors for it in TC39 or something like that way back in the day. I think this was probably 2010 or 2011, something like that.
Many years ago.
Many years ago,
developer years.
JavaScript was missing at that time some of the internationalization capabilities that are common to other systems programming languages. And what that meant was that for anybody who was writing something in JavaScript or in a browser context, that they would have to go and hit the server to get that capability, right?
Yeah, that's
you want to do a date time operation, like you have to hit the server.
Oh man!
Right? Isn't that kind of crazy?
Yeah, that's silly.
Yeah. So,
especially since it's usually just simple math, you're usually adding or subtracting, right?
Yeah, but unfortunately, it's not simple math. Like if you really want to get into the thick of,
true.
But this is actually the kind of thing that makes it so complex. Is it's such not simple math that we can't even we don't want to encode it into the runtime itself. So what we want to do is basically take a dependency on an operating system API. Right. And
that makes a ton more sense.
Right. But then the interesting thing is
those are optimized.
They should be, and they usually are.
They should be.
But then there are cases in some cases where the operating systems don't agree on certain things like date time operations and what happens in certain edge cases. So, we can end up in situations where we're a little bit out of sync and we kind of need to think about, okay, well, here's where the operating system is today. Here's where it's going to be in the next version or the version after that.
Right.
And like, what's the right thing to do for the JavaScript language, assuming that the operating system will eventually kind of support what we need. Yeah.
Yeah. When I said simple math, what I was really thinking is it's a set of rules on how you add or subtract hours or days. And
it's just, you're right, but it's not that simple because there's just a tremendous amount of complexity thinking about the time zones that you have to deal with, and then the different situations of, you're doing some kind of a comparison and you can end up with, different machines with different values based on how they do date time operations, for example.
Right.
Yeah. Or translations, or doing string conversions to different languages is another similar situation. Yeah.
Yeah, character sets.
Yeah, exactly.
All kinds of fun stuff.
Yeah,
So you mentioned that you're on the team that does Visual Studio and TypeScript, and I think you listed like three or four.
VS Code and Chakra, and
right. So how do you define a role across so many broad categories of things?
Well, I've been doing, this kind of dev tool stuff for a long time, like 16 years at this point. So I have a team of 40 PMs or so who do all of these things. So each one of them, one of them goes to TC39 every month, and his job is to make sure that JavaScript and ECMAScript are, aligned. One of them works on Node on Azure and make sure that our Node implementation on Azure is exactly what everybody wants.
Right.
Another one works on performance in the Chakra engine and, keeping up with the Joneses and making sure that, we're really pushing the edge, pushing the boundaries on JavaScript performance.
Right.
So, it's just a big team.
So what can we expect in the future from both JavaScript and TypeScript?
Well, I think the mission of TypeScript to kind of make it possible for people to write large-scale JavaScript applications continues. We're not done. So obviously...
It does make it easier, though.
It does make it easier.
I will let you know that.
Thank you. Type checking is one aspect of it, but there's also other things.
Oh, there's so many things about it, yeah.
Yeah, the minification like we talked about earlier, or other things like that. Like those, we have aspirations to provide better tooling down the road that are in totally different, areas that you might think about. That, we not only have VS Code and Visual Studio, we also now have VS for Mac. And so we also want to bring the JavaScript and TypeScript language service to VS for Mac so that...
Is it not there?
It is. It's not yet the best tooling experience, so we need to bring the language service experience into that. So we're working on that. So definitely bringing it to different experiences. But the other thing is, I would say we just really finished bringing the TypeScript language service to our code editors. And that's kind of the basis for a lot of additional tooling capabilities we could add on to it. Like once you have type checking, you can do pretty advanced refactoring experiences and things like that you couldn't do with JavaScript before. So that's, I think, what we'll be thinking about with TypeScript and JavaScript over the next few years. But kind of tooling in general and VS Code and Visual Studio and kind of the Visual Studio family overall. Like one of the things I demoed today was the Visual Studio Live Share.
That was so cool.
Thanks. It's a lot of fun to work on. It's actually been a pretty wild ride over the last couple of months getting that going. Yeah. But the idea with that is that we could collaborate on code. You stay on your machine with your favorite editor, and I stay on my machine with my favorite editor, and we can, collaborate on the same code and see each other's highlights and edits at the same time, and even share a debug session.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking on Twitter during the keynote and, tweeting about it, and a few people pointed out that Adam, I guess, released something somewhat similar.
Yeah, I've not downloaded Adam's thing yet, so I can't really speak to the detailed differences well yet. There are a lot of similarities, and in some ways it's like an awesome validation that we're, I believe in a punctuated equilibrium. Like this seems like validation that the time has come to enable remote collaboration across developers in the inner loop. So that seems great. I think we have a debugging capability, like we can do the code debugging. I don't know that they have that yet.
I haven't looked at it. I really don't know yet.
So, but I don't know. This is all news to me as well.
Yeah, and one thing that was interesting, I agree with you on the validation point, but I've been a developer for like 12 years or something, and I've used Tmux and with Emacs or Vim to get something like this right, but it's always a shared session.
Yeah.
Similarly with some of the screen sharing apps.
Yeah.
There was Screen Hero for a while.
That's right.
They got acquired by Slack. Apparently Slack's building it into Slack, but I haven't seen that yet. I keep dreaming. But the fact that, and this is different even than that, because sure, you're sharing the code and you're sharing breakpoints and, certain things about your session overall. But you work in the environment that you like being in, and I'm in the environment I like being in. And, the look and feel was totally different in the demo. And, it's like, okay, you be productive your way, I'll be productive my way, but we can still collaborate in the way that we need to in order to understand what we're doing.
Right. Exactly. Right.
This episode is sponsored by Linode. Linode is offering listeners of this podcast a $20 credit, which is good for 4 free months at their lowest plan. Their plans start at 1 gigabyte of RAM for $5 a month. You can get your servers in any of their 10 data centers, and their high memory plans start at 16 gigabytes. Get a server running in under a minute. They do hourly billing with a monthly cap on all plans and add-on services like backups, node balancers, Longview, etc. VMs for full control, running Docker containers, encrypted disks, VPNs, etc. You can run a private Git server. They provide native SSD storage, 200 gigabit network, and Intel E5 processors. They have 24/7 friendly support, even on holidays, and a 7-day money-back guaranteed. So go check them out at linode.com/adventures in Angular.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that's really powerful about it. But even more so, it's not just that you get to bring your own settings and your own tools to it, but the fact that because it's going through a remoted channel, like I don't even need to have the dependencies that you have for your program on my machine, right? If you are working on a Node app, but I don't even have Node installed, like I can still get...
Yeah, you step through it and it runs on my machine.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of crazy.
That is crazy. I'm curious, we've talked a lot about tooling and design and TypeScript.
Yeah.
How does the TypeScript VM or engine enable a lot of this stuff, or is it completely orthogonal to...
It's not quite orthogonal. You might think it is entirely orthogonal, but actually... So one of the things that we've learned to do by working on language services for a really long time, trying to make them really good, is that we have pretty complex runtime compilers that do things like decompilation when you make an edit. So basically what happens when you make an edit is like all of the dependencies that could be impacted by that edit get decompiled in the compiler.
Okay.
And then reconstructed back up. So the AST gets kind of like... it regresses, and then it kind of progresses and gets recompiled, right? And so what can happen in a co-authoring situation is both you and I could be making edits that could trigger a decompilation, right? You want to, be able to make those edits. Because of this dependencies thing, we didn't want to have to make it so that you had to replicate all of the files on your machine.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Yeah. So what we had to do was to actually augment the language service so that this decompilation, recompilation service was aware that there might be multiple cursors and multiple places where there could be edits that could be happening simultaneously. Yeah. So that's kind of one aspect of the co-authoring part of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And so all those changes then get reflected into the host machine and happens all there.
Yeah, exactly. But the language service itself had to be augmented to kind of deal with the idea that there might be multiple edits at the same time.
Interesting. Huh.
Yeah.
That is really fun. So what is the thing that you like best about working in the developer tooling area?
I've been working on it for a long time, and people ask me that a lot because I've been working on it for so long that people are like, aren't you bored? Like, this is the tech industry. You're supposed to move every 2 years. Like, why are
you tired of developers?
Yeah. And I'm not. Like, I love working for developers. And part of the reason is they're, of all of the users of software, they are some of the most enthusiastic, loyal, not loyal per se, but like what I mean is they feel passionately about the tools that they use, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And so in terms of getting feedback, even if it's bad, right? Like you get immediate feedback from developers whether or not you've built something good, right? And so that having that signal from from your users is pretty awesome. Like when you write software, how long does it take for your software to get, validated or debugged or whatever it is by your users? Like
well, it depends.
Yeah.
If I'm building it just for me, maybe not as long, but
Yeah, but if you're building it for others, like it can take weeks, sometimes months. And,
absolutely.
And even when you get that feedback, it's like, kind of.
I've been working around this issue for 6. Why didn't you tell me?
Exactly, right? But with developers, like they're going to tell you. They're going to tell you immediately, right? Because they all know how this works, and they know that feedback is part of making a better product. Yep. And so that aspect is addictive, right? Like I can't imagine working for another population.
Right.
If I left Microsoft or did something else, I would be working on developer tools. So that's one aspect that's really awesome about it. The other thing is just the fact that I get to work on kind of the cutting edge of technology, no matter what it is. Because I'm working for developers are where everything starts. Right? Like I was meeting with the team that's working on quantum computing a couple of weeks ago, right?
Dang.
Yeah. So like,
I'm going to come hang out with you now.
I get to do that because I work on developer tools.
Right.
And they need to build developer tools so that people who are going to write quantum programs, I guess, have something to write it in, right?
Yep.
So
orient the electric field of this subatomic particle.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the other thing. Like, I can't imagine going and working on consumer software or something like that, or enterprise software, and like, just I don't know. I feel like I'm in the center of the universe, really.
That's really cool. That's really, really cool.
Not to be, self-elevating that much, but it's awesome.
But it is. It's definitely interesting. I'm just trying to think where I want to go from here.
I guess the last thing is it scratches my geeky itch, right? So it's just fun. Like there's lots of cool problems in there, and
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. One thing that I'm a little curious about, you have Chakra, you've got Visual Studio Code. I'm pretty sure TypeScript as well. They're all open source. I don't know if Visual Studio itself is open source, but I think
parts of it, but not most of it. Yeah.
So, I mean, man, I remember I got into programming and Microsoft was sort of the evil empire, right? And everything was closed source and done our way.
Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of that's changed, right? I say this partially because I'm trying to get the message out, because I still hear it sometimes, right? And I'm like, this is not the Microsoft I go talk to anymore.
Yeah.
Right? The Microsoft I go talk to, they're open source, and let's make some great tools and let's get some great stuff out there. Whether it's Azure or developer tools or DevOps tools like Visual Studio Team Services or something else. It's hey, look, we want these things to be in how you do things, because we feel like it'll solve these issues and just get them out of your way, so you don't even have to think about them.
Right.
But yeah, so that the open source, how does open source impact what you do?
Well, I mean, this is another thing where I've kind of been there as Microsoft has been on the journey itself. I mean, TypeScript, when we started working on it, like I said, was 2010, and we didn't launch it until 2012. And as I mentioned, like I think the JavaScript community was not favorable towards Microsoft at that time. And so I think we had to launch it. We knew that we were kind of launching it in an environment where the community might not be receptive to anything from Microsoft. And in some ways, to kind of make it something that fit the ethos of that community, we had to make it open source.
Right.
So that was a struggle within Microsoft. I mean, I had to, work with the powers that be to like get approval for, we're going to open source it. Like it was a big deal. It took months to convince everybody at that time that that's what we were going to do.
I have friends, I've talked to people that, during that transition, it was, we're not even sure what it means to do open source.
Well, and that's the other thing is like it took our developer team months and our team overall months to understand what it meant to actually work in the open, right? Like there's a repository. Oh my God, you mean anybody could file a bug? Wait, so how quickly do I need to respond to that bug?
Right.
How do I respond to that bug? Like, can I just, no fix, like no repro? Like what's the protocol for these open source communities, right? Codes of conduct and all of that kind of stuff that comes up. Like we just had no familiarity with it at that time. But, we persisted and kind of made sure that TypeScript was available open source at that time. But I mean, in contrast, like thinking about the journey that it took us to open source the Chakra engine, so different, right? If you think about it for a second, TypeScript is a transpiler. What it does is it takes, some language that you compile, that you write as a human, compiles it down to JavaScript. That's like an innocuous operation. There's nothing that's going to happen in the course of that because it still executes in the context of the JavaScript, sandbox and runtime. That's going to compromise your machine, right? So it's literally innocuous, right? And yet, it took us months to convince everybody that we were going to do that open source.
Right.
Chakra is our JavaScript runtime.
Right. It runs in your browser. We hear about browser vulnerabilities all the time.
Yes. So it is
So it could do bad things.
It could, right? We made a decision that we thought it was the right thing to do to open source the Chakra engine. And it took a couple of conversations to get everybody on board.
Really?
Yeah. So the transition within Microsoft is so different between 2012 and, when we talked about the Chakra engine going open source, which was 2015, I think.
Yeah, we talked to Gaurav,
yeah. It's just so different, like what it took. And I think that we are now so much more familiar and kind of, I think the default at this point for developer tools is it's open source from the beginning. The only thing that, kind of keeps us from doing that is either we're not sure of that the implementation approach is right, and therefore we just don't know yet whether or not this is something that we want to, continue to maintain as an open source project. Like it's bad if you put something out there into the open source world and you kind of don't run with it. So that's one thing. But the other thing is just if we have a huge legacy code base, then it's really challenging to make it open source.
I can see that.
If it wasn't designed with, to be open source from the beginning, it's kind of hard to retrofit it to be ready.
Yeah, I mean, I can see all kinds of things in there from we need to sanitize it to not, put secrets out there to this really isn't set up for anybody to contribute to that's not steeped in it.
Right. Or to like Easter eggs being in the source code or things like that. I think we've expunged all of those, but there's source code comments and things like that you have to clean up. And there's a lot of things. Build systems, CI systems. Like there's actually a tremendous amount that you have to think about in getting a code base prepared to be open sourced.
So I'm going to ask this. We're probably going to do another interview next week with he's the VP of open source at VMware.
Okay.
And I'll probably ask him this, but I'm curious, you've been through this process. So if somebody works at medium to large business and they want to champion moving toward open source, how do they go about convincing people that this is something that the company actually wants to do and that there's some benefit to it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, for me, in a lot of ways, it's a different situation because my target audience is developers, right? And there are various developer audiences that really expect open source as kind of the basis for anything they use.
That's true. We've already embraced it as a development.
Yeah, exactly. So it's I think in some ways easier for me than, let's say, some guy at a bank who's going to go convince his bank bosses that he should open source a component that he's building. But I mean, I think the thing that carries is if you want to build something that you want to be strengthened by the community, that you think is going to end up being a broadly reusable, broadly applicable thing, but that you might not have the capacity or the business interest, the business alignment to make it as awesome as it possibly could be, but it's broadly applicable enough that others would want to help you further it along, that's a great candidate for open sourcing. I think the other thing that we found is that open sourcing stuff actually It does great things for recruiting top developers as well, because for a couple of reasons. Number one, it shows that you're thought leaders in the community,
Right.
and, people want to work for the people who are kind of, pushing the edge. But the other thing is, oftentimes, and like the Xamarin team does this, they hire people who contribute to their code bases, right? So like, if you build up the community, then you're also building your recruiting pipeline as well.
Yeah. Interesting you mentioned that too. I've been putting together a course for newish developers to find a job. And that's one of the things I tell them to do is, I'm like, if they have repos and you want to work at that company, go contribute to the repos.
Yeah.
But, I really like the idea. I mean, and this is something that a lot of developers really feel strongly about is, you know what? I want to contribute. I want to feel like I'm giving back to the community, not just writing code for my employer.
Right. And that's one other thing that I love about working for developers is there is kind of this sense of altruism in the developer community. Like, I think we are really, a lot of us at least, seem to subscribe to the idea that like a rising tide lifts all boats, right? And that, I mean, it's great that you're building something similar to me, even if we're competing. Because it means that we're advancing the state of the art for humanity, right? Like, that's cool.
Yeah. And so open source is a large part of that, that sort of sense of social responsibility that we all have as developers.
Yeah, or even just contributing to each other's productivity.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what should we expect to see next in TypeScript?
In TypeScript, I don't know. I think our roadmap is published. I didn't take a refresher on that right before this podcast, so I'm not quite sure what's quite next on the docket. But I mean, I think the thing that we're really working on is bringing the same language service to all of the Visual Studio family, and then kind of building on top of the basis of the TypeScript language service to build kind of better tooling experiences in VS Code and VS for Mac.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, let's say that over the last few years, somebody has corrupted me into using something like Emacs.
Yeah.
Right?
That's where I started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What if I decide I want to integrate the TypeScript service into Emacs so that I can get the same kinds of benefits?
Yeah.
Where do you start with something like that?
Well, the TypeScript compiler and the associated language service are open source.
Right.
So you can just go to the, TypeScript project in GitHub, in Microsoft's GitHub, repository, and use the language service directly there and integrate it in. But one of the things that we actually did in the launch of TypeScript is we actually made a language service for like Sublime Text and some other editors on the first launch because we knew that's where the JavaScript developers were. So, so those still exist, and we have other competitive tools that use the language service that Microsoft ships, and from our perspective, like, that's great. The more the more developers in the world that are using anything that has to do with Microsoft, like, that's good for Microsoft for sure.
Yeah. Well, and I love the idea too that you make it a little bit better.
Yeah.
And then I get an update to my editor and I'm better off, even though I don't have Microsoft branding on anything that I'm touching.
Right.
When you look at the future of JavaScript, I'm curious because, you've done the language design stuff.
Yeah.
I hear a lot of people saying things like, the future of JavaScript is in transpiled languages or WebAssembly or, or they go and they look at some feature that, somebody's champion on TC39 and they're thinking to themselves, that would make things so much better.
Yeah.
But, as people kind of look, okay, what's going to come next year, the year after that, right? I mean, I'm thinking along the lines of some of the dust-ups we had over ES6, or now ES7, since ES6 is mostly around.
Or 2018, or is that what they're calling it now?
Yeah, they switched it to the years. It's still 6 and 7 in my head.
Yeah, I know.
But so where do you think we're going? Like, where do you think we're going with all of this?
Going
with JavaScript.
I mean, I think generally we are going to make JavaScript a more complete programming language. If you compare it to other systems level programming languages, it still has gaps in some areas, right?
Well, we've seen some of those get filled with like Node.js building in APIs for some of that stuff.
But
sure. It's still missing stuff.
It's still missing some stuff. I think we are also going towards making it easier to write larger scale JavaScript. So encapsulation and modularity and stuff like that. There's still more that can be done. I think we are moving towards kind of embracing the different, subdomains of JavaScript and making, hey, it's a great experience to write super simple, scripting in JavaScript, and it's also a great experience to write functional-based, functional-looking programming in JavaScript. WebASM, like certainly it's not necessarily a JavaScript language thing, but as a runtime, like certainly it is the most ubiquitous runtime out there. And so it's only sensible that people start looking at what it would take to kind of, be able to compile it down to native performance. So obviously we're going to go in all of those directions. But I mean, I think in a lot of ways, like one of the things that's the most interesting that's happening right now is that the complexity of the software that we're building nowadays is obviously, so much more complex than it ever has been before.
And we're putting it more in places too. I mean, we're talking mobile, IoT,
VR, AR, and so what's
both on the web and on hardware that's just running Node.js. I mean,
it's crazy, right?
Everywhere.
Yeah. And so, like, when you start to think about those types of applications that have to end up getting built, it's very natural to start thinking about it as there is a native app that's the runtime of the kind of world that you're building, but then you can script that. So this might be more similar to the original inception of JavaScript or to scripting in gaming. That's kind of a lot of people do with Lua. I could definitely see us going in those directions. I think the other thing that's going to start happening is the idea of having like an exe or some kind of like app that's made up of this exe or some kind of like single file that is some binary representation of the app that you need to run. I think that will probably disintegrate over time. I think that it's going to be more likely that you will write very, very kind of independent small pieces, similar to how we're thinking about microservices and things like that. But even on the client side, you could just write an actor that is,
that'd be really
existing in a world, right? Like I was having a conversation with someone on the bus the other day who's working on AR and VR. And he was just like, if you think about a three-dimensional object in space that you can interact with, like that's not a program. That's that's like a body of code.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And just thinking about it in terms of, do we have sort of, we talked about, or in the keynote, they showed off some of the container stuff. And, so it's just micro containers of the small pieces that I need to make my program run on your computer. And neither of us really think about that.
Yes. Yeah. But also serverless is another huge thing. Oh, yeah. That is also another note. It's the same kind of, taking the idea of a program out and kind of making everything scripting. Yeah. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. And, I mean,
no matter what programming language you're writing in.
Yeah, I mean, I've done it in JavaScript. I've done it on AWS Lambda and Azure Functions.
Yeah.
And I mean, just the idea of I need this really simple thing done. Here's my data.
Right.
Done.
Right.
Done. And it's just so nice. And, just all these little pieces that move things out of our way so we can focus on the big picture.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. But with that, also, DevOps becomes this really big challenge because then you have like all these little tiny programs that are kind of interacting with each other that are deployed to different spots. Like, how do you deal with that? That's a big challenge. So we'll need to think about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But it seems like a lot of that is getting easier as well.
Definitely. No question. I mean, I think that we are evolving as an industry, like our practice on CI and CD and how that works.
Yep.
But even more so, like in the microservices space, I think we're evolving the idea of like, how do we think about the difference between dev versus test versus prod? How do we think about having isolation between the service that you write and the service that I write? How do we think, and this is an interesting space where like something like live share is actually super interesting, because if you're building a microservice and you have a set of dependencies for building your microservice, and I'm building my microservice, and both of us are testing against some kind of a, dev stage, but we don't actually have enlistments in each other's services.
Right.
But I still want to get feedback from you. How does that work? Do I have to go get a clone of your code?
Oh, interesting.
Or could we just have a real-time conversation over the code?
Right.
Right? Like, so I don't know how this is going to work yet. I'm really interested to see.
Well, and it's funny, too, because it seems like as we solve one problem, then it's like, it's like, okay, well, now we're up a level.
Yeah.
And we've got a new playing field to work with.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we're almost out of time. One of the things that we do at the end of our shows is a segment called Picks.
Okay.
And I don't know if you've listened to like This Week in Tech or anything like that, but they do picks. And so they just talk about stuff that they like at the end of the show.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting at Build and Ignite and Connect just to see what people are thinking about these days. Whether it's, well, I really like this TV show, or there's this coding tool that I've just been really into these days, or a set of videos on YouTube or something. So what are 2 or 3 things that have just been kind of making your life better these days? I mean, it can be chocolate, it can be coding, whatever. Are you ready to master Angular? Oasis Digital offers Angular Bootcamp, a 3-day intense workshop class for individuals or teams. They cover Angular 4 and 2 and focus on the skills and knowledge you need for complex, data-rich applications. They also still offer AngularJS for teams supporting older projects. Bring them to your site or send developers to them in St. Louis, San Francisco, New York, DC, and other cities, and online at angularbootcamp.com.
Well, I am very excited about the Visual Studio Live Share thing that I demoed today. So I'm really curious to see how people use it. And I think as we get it more robust, like I'm really anxious to use it myself.
Yeah, I'm probably going to dig into that a little bit more with Chris Dias here in an hour or so.
Okay, awesome. So that's definitely one thing. I think one of the things that I've been really enamored with and trying to kind of learn more about is there seems to be a growth of a whole bunch of online learning communities, and I'm really trying to figure out like what is the way that the next generation is going to learn everything, really, like not just computer science but math and things like that. I didn't come to this conference last year because I had a baby, and so one of the things that I wanted to do, kind of, I don't know if you have kids, but you have 5. Wow.
I have 5 kids.
Holy cow. Well, I don't know if you've had this thought, but I've had the thought that like, you kind of want to do science experiments on your kids sometimes, right? You never feel that way?
I've never done that, ever.
But I would love to think about how I could get my kids to be literate in math and science and kind of like spatial relationships at the youngest possible age.
Interesting.
Like, what could you, if you think about everybody sees a touch, phone, and they know how to pinch and zoom and like press on things. Like, you've seen that video of the 2-year-old that's like trying to pinch and zoom on a magazine, and it's like, why doesn't this work?
Yeah, like, my 2-year-old is friends with my iPad.
Yeah, like what does it mean to have intrinsic, like from the get-go? You learn language. There is something that is basic in your first few years about learning how you speak, and there is something. What's the word? What do you call it when you instinctual about it, about the way that you learn language?
Yeah.
How, like. What is that for math?
That's interesting.
Or for the scientific method?
Well, it's interesting, too, because we're seeing I mean, in some ways you see, like governments tightening control over education.
Yeah.
But then on the internet, you see this wild democratization of it with like Khan Academy.
Yeah, exactly.
And man, I don't have another hour to sit here and talk about this, but it's really interesting. I mean, my 11-year-old has ADHD fairly severely. I mean, to the point where we pulled him out of school and he's being homeschooled.
Okay.
And, he does a lot of these programs online.
Yeah.
And, my wife or I will find resources for him to learn. And, for him, it almost has to be instinctual or he won't sit through it.
Yeah.
And, I mean, he's still 11, he's almost 12, but still, it just has to kind of hit him at that level. Yeah. Just because the way he is. And I mean, how does that change?
Yeah.
And the way that we experience the world in general. I mean, my 2-year-old, she'll be 2 next week on Thanksgiving, but I mean, she yells at the Echo, Lexa. I mean, it doesn't always recognize what she's saying, but Lexa, play this song or, things like that. And it's like, how do we put things in front of them so that they kind of instinctually understand, mathematical or scientific or social.
Right. There's definitely a trade-off here, right? Mm-hmm. Because like you don't want your kids to be addicted to the iPad or the Echo or whatever it is, mm-hmm. but you do want them to be native. Mm-hmm. And so how do we make it so easy, like the Echo, right? Yeah. My 2-year-old just knows, or if she wants to scroll something on the iPad, she just totally gets it. Yeah. Yeah. So
that's interesting.
Yeah, so that's what I've been trying to figure out.
Well, when you figure it out, let me know.
I will let you know. Definitely will.
Nice. Well, I'm going to jump in with a couple of picks. I mean, one of them, just from the keynote, I mean, I'm so excited to try out the Visual Studio live sharing.
Cool.
If you don't know what it is, I was tweeting about it all day. So,
awesome.
Go back to November, 14th, 15th, on my Twitter feed, and you'll see like this wall of tweets. Definitely check it out. Is there a URL for that?
aka.ms/VS Live Share.
Awesome. And do you have to get the preview version of Visual Studio Code?
So right now, all you can do is give us your email address, and then we'll let you know as soon as the bits are available, which should be really soon, but they're not yet there.
I hate you until they're available.
When that happens, there will be a point at which you'll have to have the VS Code Insiders build to play with them. But, that like installing the Insiders build works side by side with the stable build.
Right.
So there really should be no impact in terms of like risk to your machine.
Yeah. But that was really, really exciting. And then the other thing I'm going to pick, and this was also from the keynote, is the AI school. Yeah. That they were talking about. And
we also have Visual Studio tools for AI as well that we just introduced as well. Yeah. So that's another super interesting topic, is just like, what does DevOps look like for AI? Like, that's just fascinating if you think about the models that you're building and stuff.
And kind of come full circle so that my AI figures out how to deploy my app, right?
Right. Sure. Yeah. That's actually another thing that I'm really interested in right now, is like, how can AI elevate your programming experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can it move these little pieces off so I can just focus on the big picture stuff that I care about?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, I know somebody else is going to be coming into this room soon.
Cool.
Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, we will go ahead and wrap this up. Can you just share really quickly, do you have a blog or Twitter or GitHub?
My Twitter is Amanda K. Silver. Mm-hmm. So that's probably the best place to pick up anything that I do in terms of a blog or GitHub or things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good.
Thanks.
Well, thanks again.
All right. Adios.
Bye.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.